June 14, 1944, Hereford, Texas. The dust smelled like rust and dry bones. Sophia pressed her palm against the rough pine of the barrack wall, feeling the deep heat of the afternoon sun soak through the wood. It was a heat unlike the humid weight of Naples. This was thin, sharp, an oven's breath that promised no relief. A fine yellow powder coated everything, the sill of the glassless window, the coarse grey blanket on her cot, the back of her own hand. It settled in her throat. She swallowed, but the grit remained. Outside, the sky was a blank, bleached sheet of blue, so vast it felt like a punishment. No mountains, no sea, just a horizon drawn with a ruler. Nothing to stop the eye, nothing to hide behind. 200 women, moved like parcels across an ocean, now stood blinking in this yellow light, their dark wool uniforms heavy with the memory of a different world. A truck rumbled past on a road she couldn't see, its engine a low growl that faded into the immense quiet. The quiet was the strangest part, not the quiet of a sleeping city, but an empty quiet, a silence that had existed long before they arrived and would remain long after they were gone. Her stomach clenched, a familiar knot of hunger and fear, but then a new smell cut through the dust. Acrid, clean, something chemical. She saw a woman named Louisa sniffing the air near the washroom, a perplexed frown on her face. The scent was sharp, like a hospital, but not exactly. It was the smell of something being relentlessly scoured, wiped clean of any trace of what had come before. This place, this Camp Hereford, was not what the propaganda had promised. The Americans were supposed to be soft, decadent, undisciplined. Their prisons, she had imagined, would be chaotic and cruel, a reflection of their flawed national character. Yet the order here was absolute, almost unnerving. The lines of the barracks were perfectly straight. The gravel paths were raked. The silence was punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic sounds of a well-oiled machine she couldn't yet see. Sophia and the other women were the newest components, dropped into its workings. They were members of the Servizio Ausiliario Femminile *, the SAF, Mussolini's female auxiliaries, volunteers, many of them. They had served in offices, hospitals, and anti-aircraft batteries, convinced they were building a new Roman Empire. It had been captured in the final collapse of the Axis forces in North Africa, processed in nameless coastal camps, and herded onto a ship whose name no one bothered to tell them. The journey itself had been a blur of nausea and disorientation, a grey limbo between a lost world and an unknowable one. Now the unknowable had a name, Texas. The stakes had once been victory, ideology, the fate of a nation. Now they were simpler, more stark. The next meal, a clean change of clothes, information. Where were their brothers, their fathers, their husbands? Was Italy still a country? The constraints were no longer the Allied blockade or the dwindling fuel supplies, but the tall wire fences that shimmered in the heat, enclosing them in this vast, yellow emptiness. A young American guard, a woman not much older than Sophia herself, walked by. Her uniform was crisp cotton, not wool. She didn't march. She ambled, a set of keys jingling at her hip. She did not look at Sophia with hatred or even curiosity. She looked bored. The sheer indifference was more disorienting than any overt hostility would have been. The contrast began with the bread. In Italy, for the last year, bread had been a grey, dense thing, heavy with sawdust and extenders. A slice was a treasure, to be eaten slowly, crumb by crumb. Here on their first morning, they were given trays piled high with slices of bread that were impossibly white, soft, and uniform. Sophia watched a woman named Elena hold a piece up to the light, as if inspecting a jewel. It was weightless. It tasted of nothing and everything at once, a bland, industrial sweetness that bore no resemblance to the sour, earthy loaves of her memory. That was the first comparison in a list that grew longer each day. At home, coffee was roasted barley, a bitter, unsatisfying brew. Here it was real coffee, dark and fragrant, served with a spoonful of actual sugar, not the gritty saccharine they had been using for years. 2 spoonfuls if you wanted. No one was counting. The water was another shock. In her apartment building in Rome, the water was shut off for 16 hours a day. Here, you turned a metal knob and water, hot or cold, poured out in an endless, steaming torrent. Louisa discovered this first, letting it run over her hands, her expression a mixture of awe and guilt, as if she were committing a terrible sin of waste. The clothes they were issued were not new, but they were whole. No patches on the knees, no frayed cuffs. The socks were a revelation, thick cotton without a single darned spot. Grazia, who had been a seamstress, ran her thumb over the factory-perfect seam of a sock, her skilled fingers tracing a line of impossible, casual perfection. It was a small thing, but it was everything. It spoke of a system where things were not endlessly mended until they fell apart. They were simply replaced. This logic of disposability was as foreign as the landscape. It was a wealth so profound, it didn't even recognize itself as wealth. It was just the way things were. The women became quiet accountants of this alien abundance. They didn't speak of it in grand terms, they noticed the details, the small, irrefutable facts that accumulated day by day. Maria, who had worked in a fascist party records office, started keeping a mental tally. 3 blankets per cot, not the one thin one she'd had in the transit camp. Soap, a whole bar of it for each woman, a pale, waxy rectangle that smelled faintly of flowers. It wasn't the harsh lye soap she was used to, the kind that left your skin red and raw. This soap made lather. She remembered her mother boiling ashes and animal fat for months to create a single precious block of soap for the entire family. Here, they used it to wash their hands, their clothes, the floors. Maria watched an American guard drop a half-used bar into the trash. She felt a physical pang, a ghost of her mother's desperate thrift. Lucia, a young woman from Bologna, took to watching the road beyond the fence. She had learned to count military vehicles, the shape of a German Panzer, an Italian Fiat truck. Now she counted civilian cars, sedans, coupes, pickup trucks, painted in bright, glossy colors. On her first Sunday, she counted 57 cars passing in a single hour, more private vehicles than she had seen in her entire home city over the past year. They weren't military, they weren't for party officials. They seemed to belong to ordinary people, people going somewhere on a Sunday, using gasoline for a purpose other than war. The thought was so baffling it made her head hurt. It wasn't just the objects themselves, but the casualness with which they were used. It was the constant, low hum of electricity, a sound she associated only with factories or military command posts, now used to power lights in every room all day, if one wished. It was the sight of a discarded Coca-Cola bottle, its intricate glass shape a piece of commercial art, left in the dust. Something so carefully manufactured, so full of precious sugar and flavor, was now just trash. These women, trained to see the world through the lens of sacrifice and scarcity, were now forced to witness a reality built on an opposite principle. A principle they couldn't yet name, but which they felt in the heft of a full loaf of bread and saw in the endless stream of cars on a Texas highway. The mechanism enabling this was a ghost, an invisible architecture that hummed just beneath the surface of their daily lives. It was not a system of charismatic leaders and grand rallies, but one of logistics, infrastructure, and relentless production. The United States, a continent away from the front lines, had transformed itself into the fabled arsenal of democracy. But what the women of Camp Hereford were witnessing was not the arsenal, but the pantry. The system's true genius was its ability to fight a global war while simultaneously sustaining, and even expanding, a domestic consumer economy. The logic was a stepwise chain of causes and effects that began thousands of miles away. A factory in Detroit could retool one assembly line to produce airplane engines, while the next line continued to stamp out parts for refrigerators. A farm in California, untouched by bombs or invading armies, could use mechanized tractors and chemical fertilizers to produce a surplus of food so vast that feeding prisoners of war according to the strictures of the Geneva Convention was not a burden, but a simple matter of distribution. A woman like Sophia, observing a supply truck arrive at the camp, saw more than just food. She saw a truck with 4 intact rubber tires, a full tank of gasoline, and a driver who would be paid a wage. She saw a road network capable of moving goods efficiently across thousands of miles. She saw a packaging industry that could produce millions of tin cans and cardboard boxes. She was seeing the visible output of an integrated continental economy. The schematic metaphor that began to form in the women's minds was that of a vast, double-sided machine. On one side, it forged the weapons and armies that had defeated them. On the other, it churned out an endless supply of white bread, Coca-Cola, and nylon stockings. They were not prisoners of an army, they realized. They were prisoners of a factory. The rules that governed their existence, the minimum calorie counts, the square footage of living space, the access to medical care were not signs of American kindness. They were products of the same industrial efficiency, a set of standards to be met, logged, and reported, just like the production quotas in a steel mill. They were a line item in the budget of a superpower. This perception of a different reality extended beyond material goods into the realm of human behavior, presenting a secondary, and perhaps more profound, contrast. The women's world in fascist Italy had been defined by rigid social hierarchies and prescribed gender roles. A woman's place was in the home, her purpose to produce sons for the state. Their own service in the SAF was a radical, war-driven exception, but it operated within a strict military framework. Here, through glimpses of the civilian women who worked on the base as clerks or nurses, they saw a different model. They saw American women who drove their own cars, pulling up to the gates of the camp with a casual competence that was startling. Lucia watched a nurse, no older than herself, back a large sedan into a tight parking space with one hand on the wheel. In Italy, a woman driving was a rare sight, an emblem of aristocratic or bohemian eccentricity. Here, it seemed normal. They wore trousers, not as a political statement, but for comfort and practicality. Their interactions with the male guards and administrators were marked by an easy, informal confidence. They looked the men in the eye when they spoke. They laughed openly. They expressed opinions without deference. One afternoon, a group of prisoners was tasked with gardening near the administration building. Through an open window, Grazier heard a female secretary arguing with a male officer about a filing system. Her voice wasn't shrill or pleading, it was firm, insistent. The officer, a captain, seemed to be listening. He wasn't yelling or dismissing her, he was engaging with her argument. Grazier exchanged a look with the woman next to her. This was unthinkable. It violated a fundamental law of nature as they understood it. This social casualness was as bewildering as the material abundance. The United States had mobilized over 6 million women into its workforce to support the war effort, a fact the Italian prisoners did not know, but an effect they could clearly see. It was a society that seemed to run on a different set of rules about what a woman was and what she could do. This discovery was unsettling, a challenge not just to their political indoctrination, but to their very sense of self. The friction was immense, a silent grinding of two incompatible worldviews. Their fascist education had provided a complete, self-contained ideology. It was built on the pillars of sacrifice, discipline, community, and the spiritual superiority of their nation. America, they had been taught, was the opposite, a decadent, individualistic, materialistic society, rotten from within, its strength an illusion. The prisoners were prepared for brutality, for hardship, for a confirmation of this worldview. They were not prepared for evidence of its opposite. They were not prepared for competence. The camp was run with an efficiency that was deeply ideologically troubling. The plumbing worked. The electricity stayed on. The food deliveries were on time. This was not the chaos of a failing state. This was the calm, humming power of a functioning one. This quiet competence inverted the roles they had expected to play. They, the disciplined soldiers of a spiritual revolution, were now the idle, helpless recipients of a system they were supposed to despise. The Americans, the soft materialists, were their efficient, organized, and dispassionate keepers. The ideological clash happened not in debates or arguments, but in the quiet moments of reflection inside the barracks. A woman like Elena, a true believer who had joined the SAF out of fervent conviction, would lie on her cot at night and feel the foundations of her world cracking. How could a nation so spiritually bankrupt produce so much? How could a people so individualistic organize so effectively? It was a violation of everything she had been taught. The propaganda had been a lie, not a small lie, but a fundamental, world-defining lie. The shame of this realization was a bitter pill. It wasn't just that their nation had lost the war. It was that the entire belief system that had given their lives meaning and purpose was being dismantled, piece by piece, not by force or persuasion, but by the irrefutable evidence of a well-run prison camp and an endless supply of white bread. The system they were in didn't need to argue with them, it just needed to exist. Its very existence was the most powerful argument of all. The evidence that dismantled their beliefs was not found in books or lectures, but in the mundane, quantifiable facts of their confinement. The women, trained in a culture of scarcity, became meticulous observers of this new economy. Their recollections, filtered through years of deprivation, read like an auditor's report. The Geneva Convention of 1929 stipulated that prisoners of war should receive a diet equivalent to that of the detaining powers' depot troops. For the women at Hereford, this translated to a daily caloric intake of around 3,000 calories, a figure that would have been unthinkable for a civilian, let alone a soldier in Italy. Maria, the former clerk, would mentally reconstruct the day's meals, estimating the weight of the meat, the volume of the milk, the sheer luxury of the potatoes served without their peels. These were not just meals, they were data points proving a logistical miracle. Records from the quartermaster corps support these memories, detailing the massive quantities of foodstuffs procured for the nation's 425,000 Axis prisoners. In 1944 alone, the system purchased nearly 200 million pounds of potatoes, 110 million pounds of flour, and 67 million pounds of sugar, specifically for the POW population. The specifics of camp life provided further proof. Each barrack was heated by a central furnace, a luxury reserved for the wealthiest elite in their home country. The infirmary was stocked with medicines like penicillin and sulfur drugs, wonder drugs they had only heard about in radio broadcasts, now available to treat their common ailments. Some of the women were assigned work details in the camp laundry. There they confronted another technological marvel, large, electric washing machines. They watched mesmerized as a single American whack could launder more clothing in an hour than an entire Italian village could in a day of back-breaking work with washboards and cold water. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about force multiplication. It was about a system that leveraged technology to free up human labor, a concept that fundamentally reframed their understanding of national strength. Their nation had prized human will and sacrifice. This nation had built machines. Looking at the evidence, they were forced to conclude which was more effective. The psychological cost of this slow-motion revelation was immense. The initial shock gave way to a persistent, low-grade disorientation, a kind of spiritual vertigo. The body registered the change first. After weeks of adequate nutrition, the chronic, gnawing hunger that had been a constant companion for years began to fade. Women noticed their own hands looked different, the skin less dry, the knuckles less prominent. They were healthier, stronger, and this physical well-being felt like a betrayal. A deep sense of guilt settled over the barracks. Every full meal was a reminder of their starving families back home. A letter from a sister describing the desperate search for bread in the rubble of Milan could reduce a woman to silent, racking sobs in the middle of the night. The quiet hum of the camp's generator was a constant, maddening soundtrack to her private grief. It was the sound of a world that worked, while hers had fallen apart. The emotional crescendo was not loud or violent. It was a quiet, internal collapse. It happened to Sophia one afternoon while she was watching a baseball game the guards had organized. The men were running and shouting, laughing. The sun was warm. Someone had a radio playing music, a cheerful, swinging rhythm she'd never heard before. In her pocket, she had a piece of hard candy given to her by one of the nurses. A small, sweet thing. And suddenly, the sheer, crushing absurdity of her situation broke over her. She was a prisoner of war on the other side of the world, healthier and safer than she had been in her own country. Her cause was lost, her leaders were gone, her home was in ruins, and she was standing in the sun, listening to jazz, about to eat a piece of candy. The dissonance was too great. She felt a wave of nausea. She slipped away from the small crowd back to the empty barrack and lay on her cot, her body trembling. It was the feeling of being utterly, completely erased. Her past, her beliefs, her sacrifices, they all amounted to nothing. She was just a body, being kept alive by a system that had already defeated her so thoroughly it could afford to be generous. The revelation did not arrive in a flash of insight, but seeped in slowly, like the relentless Texas heat. It crystallized in the minds of women like Sophia, lying on their cots in the dark, trying to reconcile the world they were promised with the one they now inhabited. The constant, nagging question, how could a decadent nation be so powerful, finally yielded an answer. And the answer was a simple, profound re-evaluation of the nature of power itself. The true measure of a system's strength was not its ideological purity, but its logistical capacity to deliver material well-being. The war, she now understood, had not been a contest of national will or spiritual fervor, as Mussolini had proclaimed from his balconies. It had been a contest of production lines, supply chains, and calorie counts. And in that contest, there had never been any doubt about the victor. The refrigerators, the radios, the Coca-Cola bottles were not the symbols of a weak and decadent culture. They were the evidence of the very system that had won the war. They were the mundane, domestic expression of the same industrial might that produced aircraft carriers and atomic bombs. A nation that could provide its civilians with nylon stockings in the middle of a global conflict was not a nation on the verge of collapse. It was a nation with such a profound manufacturing surplus that it could afford both guns and butter and still have enough left over to feed its enemies. This was the turn, the moment the pieces clicked into place. The American system didn't win because it was morally superior or because its soldiers were braver. It won because it was a more efficient machine for converting raw materials into usable goods, whether those goods were tanks or washing machines. The ideology was almost secondary. The factory was primary. This understanding connected the smallest personal moments to the largest historical forces. A single, perfectly white slice of bread was no longer just food. It was the end product of a vast agricultural and industrial system untouched by war. The casual flick of a light switch by a guard was a demonstration of a national power grid, a complex web of engineering and infrastructure that her own country, for all its grand pronouncements, had never managed to build on such a scale. The cause and effect ladder was brutally clear. A stable, resource-rich continent led to a powerful industrial base. That industrial base could simultaneously fuel a war effort and a consumer economy. This dual capacity created a society of such material abundance that its reality systematically dismantled the propaganda-fueled beliefs of its enemies. The experience of these Italian women suggests a durable, if unsettling, takeaway. Deeply held ideological convictions tend to weaken when confronted with overwhelming, daily evidence of a system that simply works better on a material level. Their fascist identity, forged in the crucible of sacrifice and scarcity, could not survive the quiet, relentless pressure of American abundance. The motifs of their imprisonment became the symbols of their re-education. The hands that had once been raised in a fascist salute were now used to scrub floors with factory-made soap, or to hold a shockingly cold bottle of Coca-Cola. The quiet of the Texas night, once a symbol of their isolation, became a space for agonizing reappraisal. And the numbers, the simple counts of cars and blankets and calories, became the tools they used to perform a painful audit of their own shattered worldview. The yellow dust still settles on the windowsills at Hereford. The sky is still a punishing, endless blue. Imagine Sophia, years later, standing not in a prison camp, but in a modern Italian kitchen. She reaches into a refrigerator, its electric hum a familiar echo of that Texas generator, and pulls out a bottle of milk for her grandchild. The object in her hand is no longer a symbol of a foreign power, but a simple part of her daily life. A part of the new world that was built from the ashes of the old. That transformation, from a symbol of enemy strength to an object of domestic normality, is the real story. It is a quiet reminder that the most profound revolutions are not always the ones waged with guns, but the ones waged with bread and soap and refrigerators. The things we touch every day are not silent. They are carriers of history, embedded with the logic of the systems that created them. Consider the objects in your own life. What systems do they represent? What stories do they tell about power? Share one in the comments below. The journey of these women was far from over. Being a prisoner of a system was one thing. Returning to a home that system had irrevocably changed was another. What happened when they were finally sent back to an Italy they no longer recognized? That is the story for our next episode. Subscribe so you don't miss it.